President, I'd like to join my colleagues from Alaska in commending the United States Senate for confirming Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State. I think he's the right person at the right time, and we need somebody there. There's too much going on around the world to have that job be vacant, and there's an important meeting of foreign ministers of the major countries in the world that's going on tomorrow that he needed to attend. So whether it's North Korea and what's happening there, where he's been very involved, or Iran, and the continuing concerns we have with regard to the nuclear agreement with Iran, or whether it's what's happening in Syria, certainly what's happening on the eastern border of Ukraine, where I was recently, there's lots of hotspots around the world right now, and a need for us to have somebody in place who understands the importance of addressing those issues and addressing some of the bigger and longer-term challenges we have with countries like Russia and China, to be sure that we can have a more constructive relationship. So it's good to have somebody in that job. When John Kerry came up for a confirmation here in the Senate, not everybody agreed with him on the policies. When Hillary Clinton came up for a vote, not everybody agreed with her on the policies, but they agreed that they were qualified, as Mike Pompeo clearly is, and they agreed that a president should have the ability to have his or her person in that job, particularly Secretary of State. Therefore, both of those cases, the vote was 94 senators in favor. And again, I'm just glad that the Senate chose to confirm him, but I do wish that we'd had more of a bipartisan approach to it, because I think it's important for us to show around the world that we indeed do have momentum behind this nominee and his ability to lead our country in the area of soft power diplomacy all around the world. I think he'll do a good job. I think he'll earn the trust of those who voted for him today, and also I think he will be able to change the views, perhaps, of some of my colleagues who voted no today. So congratulations to Mike Pompeo, and I'm happy for our country that he's in place. Mr. President, I come to the floor today to talk about an issue that has gripped my state and every state represented in this chamber, and that's the opioid epidemic. This is prescription drugs and heroin and fentanyl, carfentanil, and it's something that we have talked about on this floor more in the last couple of years than we had at any time really in the history of this body, and we've passed some good legislation, but boy, there's so much more to do. Sadly, this crisis continues to unfold, and at least in my state, and I believe in most states in this country, it's getting worse, not better. So we've started to take some important actions, but it's time to take more. Just last week, a couple in Youngstown, Ohio, were sentenced for reckless homicide and endangering children after their 16-month-old daughter overdosed and died. She was exposed to carfentanil, one of these synthetic forms of opioids that unfortunately has come into so many communities in this country, and in fact is the biggest single concern we have right now in Ohio and many other states. In fact, in Ohio, we had an increase in overdoses last year, and 60% of those overdoses were from fentanyl or carfentanil, this synthetic form of opioids that was hardly present 5 years ago. So as we made progress on prescription drugs, heroin came in. As we made progress on heroin, fentanyl and carfentanil came in. And that's the latest poison, and there's a need for us to push back and push back hard. Opioid deaths are now the #1 cause of death in my home state of Ohio. It's the #1 cause of accidental death in the United States of America. You think about that. How many people who are being affected by this? And it's across the board. It knows no zip code. It's not just in the urban areas. It's not just in the rural areas. It's in the suburban areas. It's everywhere. It's something that we can make a difference on. And I've seen some programs that are actually working well to try to turn the tide and push back. One I will mention is funded in part from legislation we passed in this chamber just a year and a half ago. It's in Columbus, Ohio. It's called the Mary Haven Addiction Stabilization Center. It's an attempt by the county, Franklin County, which is largely Columbus, Ohio, to come together and say, we've got to do something here to get more people who have overdosed into treatment. Because one of the many challenges we face in this crisis is the gaps. And one huge gap is the fact that people who overdose have had their lives saved through this miracle drug called Narcan, which reverses the effects of an overdose. But then after coming out of their overdose, getting conscious again, they simply go back in to the community and back to the environment that created this potential overdose situation in the first place. So once again, a week later perhaps, maybe days later, in some cases hours later, the person may overdose again. The answer is not just applying Narcan, as important as it is, because we do need to save lives. The important thing is to then get that person into a program where they can begin to deal with their addiction, where they can get the support longer term through a recovery program to stay away from the old environment and the old gang that got them involved in this issue perhaps in the first place. Addiction is a disease. Treatment is required, just as it would be for other diseases. So I'm excited about what's happening at Maryhaven Addiction Recovery, because at this center, they are bringing people in who have overdosed, and then in the same facility, there are about 50 beds for treatment. So instead of having the vast majority of people who overdose and come into an emergency room, go home or go back to the old environment, 80% of the people at Maryhaven are going into treatment. That's a huge change. That's a sea change. That will have an enormous impact on dealing with the 200,000 people or so in my home state of Ohio who are currently addicted. It will help them get into a decent program, get through the detox, get into recovery, and have the opportunity to get their lives back together. That program is funded, again, in large part from federal funding that came from this legislation we passed here about a year and a half ago. About $1 million, maybe $1.2 million was then matched by some private funding, state and local funding. And again, we have this new project that I think can be emulated around the state because it seems to be working really well. The Cures Act, which we passed here, has provided to Ohio just recently $26 million in new funding, and we need it badly. And we need to put it to use in ways that work. And again, this is an example of something that's actually well thought out, is going to help to close the gap and make a difference. In 2016, we were told that we had the deadliest year on record in terms of overdoses. Unfortunately, it looks like 2017, when we have the final numbers, is going to be worse. It certainly will be in Ohio. The Franklin County corridor, and the Franklin County is the Columbus, Ohio area. The coroner recently came out with their numbers for 2017. They had a overdose death rate that was higher than 2016. We lost 520 of our fellow citizens to overdoses in Franklin County in 2017. That was a 47% increase from 2016. So not just a little increase, a huge increase. And by the way, a staggering 2/3 of those, 66% of those deaths, were from this synthetic heroin we talked about, this synthetic opioids, fentanyl and carfentanil. That's why I said earlier, that's really the big issue now in so many communities around the country. Just last month, Franklin County experienced 18 overdoses in just 1 week. One county, 18 overdoses in 1 week. This was just last month. That's an average of over 2 deaths per day. And think about that when you're thinking about just one county out of 88 and the impact this is having. We need to do more at the federal level to combat this epidemic, and I'd like to talk about a couple of pieces of new legislation that would build on the success we've had in this body of drafting new legislation that helps to direct this money in ways that is going to make a difference toward evidence-based programs, not just throwing money at the problem, but being sure that the money is well spent. One of the pieces of legislation is critical to this issue of the fentanyl and carfentanil coming into our communities. Unbelievably, this poison that we talked about today, 2/3 of the deaths in this county in Ohio last year were because of this fentanyl. This 16-month-old baby we talked about was killed through a carfentanil, another synthetic. Unbelievably, this stuff is coming in through our U.S. mail system primarily. So it's coming not over the border primarily, or not in some other way like heroin might, or even prescription drugs, but it's literally coming through the mail, primarily from China. So you have evil chemists in China mixing up this poisonous brew that becomes fentanyl, and then it gets shipped through the mail system into our communities, sometimes to a P.O. box, sometimes to someone's home, sometimes to a business. And unfortunately, we do not have the ability within the U.S. Postal Service to push back. To me, this is an obvious example where this body ought to come together and say, you know what? Let's provide law enforcement the tools they need to be able to stop some of this poison from coming in. If you were to send this same fentanyl by FedEx or UPS or DHL, a private carrier, they would have to provide law enforcement in advance data as to the package, where it's coming from, what's in it, where it's going. With that data, law enforcement can then target packages, suspect packages, and pull them off the line and pull some of this poison out of our communities. I've been to these distribution centers where the private carriers do exactly that. They have Customs and Border Protection officials there. They have rooms there that have the proper venting to be able to open these packages. As you know, this fentanyl, carfentanil, is so dangerous. Our first responders are putting their lives at risk every day just by dealing with it. But what they're able to do is to stop this poison from coming in, which helps at a minimum to raise the cost. Because right now, one of the reasons it's expanding is because it's deadly. It's something that is causing many more overdoses and deaths than ever before, but it's also relatively inexpensive. So our legislation is very simple. It's called the STOP Act. It's co-sponsored by Amy Klobuchar, Democrat from Minnesota. And the notion is to say to our U.S. Postal Service, you should have to provide that same information, because law enforcement tells us unless they have that information, it's like finding a needle in a haystack. 900 million packages a year. Hard to imagine how they're going to be able to stop those packages without having at least that tool of knowing what's in those packages, where it's coming from, where it's going, so they can use their analytics, the big data, to be able to identify those packages and to be able to stop them. Last month, a man from Cleveland, Ohio, was charged after undercover law enforcement agents found he was selling fentanyl that he had just bought online from China. According to the prosecutor, and I quote, "The defendant ordered thousands of deadly doses of fentanyl from China, brought it to a residential neighborhood in Euclid, Ohio, and then mailed the dangerous drugs all over Ohio and the country using our own mail system." The permanent subcommittee here in the United States Senate, which is a group that I chair, did a year-long investigation of this issue. We completed this several months ago, and unfortunately, what it showed was exactly what you would suspect, which is that the traffickers, when asked, how should we ship these drugs that we're buying from you online, because we had an undercover person working for us. He was a member of the Homeland Security Department, someone who deals with these issues every day. He actually contacted websites around the country, and unfortunately, the websites all said the same thing. Yeah, we'll sell you this deadly drug, but you got to ship it through the U.S. mail system. We'll guarantee delivery if you do that. We were able to find 5 different websites that were openly selling fentanyl. They all told us where to send it. By using some of the information that we had based on the payment systems they were using, we were able to identify the people who had been shipped drugs through these sites. We found, incidentally, that just in a short period of time, 7 people had died of overdoses from getting drugs from these particular websites. We also were able to refer to law enforcement some other people who apparently were dealing these drugs by taking large quantities. But even this person in Euclid, Ohio, we talked about, thousands of deadly doses of fentanyl were found. That could be in a package about this size. 3 flakes of this stuff can kill you. So at a minimum, we've got to be sure that our U.S. Postal Service is giving law enforcement these tools to be able to help stop this deadly poison. The Postal Service has begun over the last year or so to make some progress in this area. But still, they tell us that only 36% of the packages transported into this country have any kind of advanced electronic data. As we dug into this deeper and having researched and gone to some of these sites where the U.S. Postal Service is providing information, we also found out that It's not 36% because 20% of the packages that they are requiring this information on, where law enforcement said, I need to pull that package out, 20% of those packages went into the community anyway because of lack of communication with law enforcement. Finally, we're finding out that it may be 36% of the packages, but much of the information is not helpful. So we need to have new rules in place that say to countries, if you want to do business with the United States and send your packages here, you got to play ball with us and provide this digital information up front so our law enforcement can deal with what is clearly a crisis in this country. It's a glaring loophole in the screening process. It undermines the safety and security of our country, not just for drugs, but for other issues as well. And it's time we fix it. After 9/11 and the terrible tragedy of that day, this Congress decided to require private carriers to require all of that information, the advanced electronic data, because of the risk of terrorism, frankly. And we said at the time, the post office needs to do a study on this to give them time to get ready. That was over 15 years ago, and they still haven't done it. They need to provide law enforcement with the tools they need by requiring advanced electronic data on all packages entering the United States. 32 of my Senate colleagues, by the way, 19 Republicans, 12 Democrats, and 1 independent, have signed on as co-sponsors of this legislation. So it already has the support of 1/3 of the Senate. It's been endorsed by President Trump's Opioid Commission because it's a common sense solution to a growing problem around the country. There's House companion legislation to do this. Stopping this influx of fentanyl is going to happen only if we stop how it's coming, which is through our Postal Service from countries overseas, primarily China. We also need a more comprehensive approach, of course, to the drug issue. It's not enough just to stop the supply if you have a strong demand. Dealing with the demand includes prevention efforts that are included in legislation that we passed in this body about 1.5 years ago and still need to be implemented. We have new legislation to help increase that comprehensive approach. The last bill was called the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, again signed into law at the end of 2016. Now we have a new bill called CARA 2.0, and it provides more resources for evidence-based prevention, treatment, and recovery programs. It'll help people get into longer-term treatment where they can truly overcome their addiction. It has helped to overcome the stigma by treating addiction as a disease just by passing that first bill. Now it's time for us to ensure that we're looking at what works and building on it. I've introduced this legislation with my colleagues, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and 6 others, Senator Shelley Moore Capito, Amy Klobuchar, Dan Sullivan, Maggie Hassan, Bill Cassidy, who's sitting in the chair today, and Maria Cantwell, 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats. We've kept this bipartisan. Other members have joined in as well. And again, it picks up where the Cures legislation and the CARA legislation left off to provide a better framework as to how we can spend the extra resources that this Congress has wisely determined to put against this fight. In the spending bill that was just passed, there was additional $6 billion over 2 years put against this issue. Let's be sure the money is well spent. Let's be sure we have a roadmap to build on the successes we've had and ensure that that money is going to things that actually can make a difference. We talked about one earlier, this Addiction Stabilization Center. We also know that one way we could spend our money better is to have a better prescription drug monitoring program nationally. So every state now has some sort of prescription drug monitoring program, but often they don't talk to each other. This is something that is required in my state of Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky, and Indiana, Michigan, all states where there is also an opioid crisis. Pennsylvania, we need to be sure they're talking together, so when someone goes to get a prescription, the information is logged, and if the person goes out of the state to order a prescription across a border, maybe just right across the border, that information is provided just as it would be if it was within that state. That's in our legislation as well. We also target addiction at its source. About 80% of the people who die of overdoses today probably started on prescription drugs. That's the latest data we have. Some of that was prescription drugs that were provided to that individual as a result of an accident or an injury. They became physically addicted because they were prescribed an opioid for pain relief. The stories are heartbreaking. The parents would come to me and say, and this has happened twice, my son or my daughter went to get a wisdom tooth extracted, and the dentist gave my son or my daughter opioids. In one case, it was 60 pills, Percocets or OxyContin. And sure enough, that young person had a physical addiction develop because of that. And then when the pills were harder to get or more expensive, they turned to something less expensive and more accessible, which was heroin or fentanyl or carfentanil, and then overdosed and died. These are 17-year-old children who were prescribed this medication. But there are other cases as well. I've met adults who are well into their 30s or 40s, leading successful lives, well established in their community, well connected in their families, loving families. They had an accident or an injury, maybe it was a car accident, and were given pain medication, opioids, and became physically addicted. And this addiction is a tough one to climb out of. And so many people then, again, turn to another substance which is more available, more accessible, maybe less expensive, and then the overdose, and then the death, and people say, how could this have happened? Well, it happened when you go back because of a prescription drug. Something was overprescribed. Others might buy prescription drugs on the street. This Saturday is Drug Take-Back Day in America. And I hope that everybody who's listening here will think about whether they could go into their own medicine cabinet, or maybe their parents or grandparents, and take out some of these opioids and then have those disposed of properly at a police station or someplace else. I know Kroger's doing this in Ohio and other states. Find out where your drug take-back location is. Take these drugs in, get rid of them. Because I've just heard too many cases, unbelievably, of people stealing these drugs and using them, and then again developing that addiction or selling them and someone else develops the addiction. Again, the thought is that probably 8 out of 10 people dying of overdoses started with prescription drugs. So our legislation does deal with that. It deals with overprescribing because it must be dealt with. It requires doctors and pharmacists to use drug monitoring programs to assure we're not overprescribing. And it sets a 3-day limit on prescriptions for acute pain. We accept chronic pain, we have exceptions for cancer, but for acute pain, the surgeries we talked about, we're using the science, the good science from the Center for Disease Control, CDC, and others, that says two things. One, after the 3rd day of using these opioids, in that 4th day, 5th day, 6th day is when the opportunity for an addiction grows dramatically. And the chances of you falling into that addiction increases significantly. Second, in terms of pain and dealing with pain, we've also learned that for acute pain, for most kinds of procedures, there are other kinds of pain medication available. I've talked to the dentists a lot on this. There's a dentist from Ohio who's a good man, Joe Crowley, who's now president of the American Dental Association. He's working with the dentists to try to ensure that we have new policies in place that discourage the use of opioids altogether for things like a wisdom tooth being removed. But to the extent it's used after the 1st and 2nd and 3rd day, it's much less necessary, much less useful, and other pain medication can take its place. So as a result, we do have in our legislation something that's a dramatic difference from the unfortunate overprescribing that continues to go on in our country in too many instances. And that's a 3-day limit. After 3 days, if you continue to have the kind of pain that can only be dealt with opioids, if you're one of the few individuals where that's true, go back to the doctor, get another prescription, but you have to go through a process to do that. The alternative is we're going to continue to see more and more people become addicted through prescription drugs as a gateway, and then again getting into this terrible cycle of overdoses and eventually overdose and dying in too many cases. So CARA 2.0 has these policy changes, as well as the additional funding for prevention programs, treatment programs, recovery programs. It also helps our first responders by saying, if you can't afford the cost of Narcan, we'll help you out, but also to give you training in Narcan, and also to deal with this gap between the immediate overdose reversal using Narcan and then going into detox, between detox and treatment, between treatment and longer-term recovery, to try to ensure that you have continuity. This is something that just makes so much sense and can save so many lives. These legislative efforts we're talking about here are important. So for those who are watching, and maybe some staff members watching from some of the offices, please check it out. Check out the STOP Act if you're not already a co-sponsor. Check out CARE 2.0 if you're not already a co-sponsor. Be sure we're doing everything we possibly can here to make a difference and begin to reverse this tide, begin to save lives again, rather than having this discouraging increase in addiction. And it's not all about overdoses and deaths, as tragic as that is. It's about the millions of Americans whose lives are getting off track, who may not overdose and may not end up needing Narcan, but who are pulling away from their family, who are not working, who are not engaged in their community, who are giving up on their friends and their loved ones. A lot of people in this chamber are concerned about the fact that so many Americans are out of work today and not showing up even on the unemployment rolls because they've left work altogether. They're not even looking for work. Economists say our labor force participation rate for men is historically low, probably the lowest it's ever been in the history of this country. When you combine men and women, you have to go back to the 1970s to see as many people who are out of work altogether. I agree, that's a big problem. I would urge my colleagues to look at the impact of opioids on that problem. There are two recent studies, one by the Department of Labor, one by the Brookings Institution, which indicate in the strongest possible terms that opioids are driving much of this dysfunction in our workforce today. So to employers out there who are saying, economy's growing, the tax cuts are working, regulatory relief is working, but I can't find workers. 44% of those who are out of the workforce, according to a Department of Labor study from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 44% took a prescription pain medication the day before. The Brookings study shows that 47% of men between 25 and 55, able-bodied men, are taking pain medication on a daily basis. These are frightening numbers. And by the way, I can't imagine that's over-reported. I imagine it's under-reported because of the stigma attached to this issue of opioid addiction, because of the potential legal liability people could be in for admitting it. And even so, almost half of those surveys say they're not working, they're not even looking for work, but they're taking pain medication on a daily basis. So this affects all of us. Go to your firehouse in your community and ask them, are they doing more overdose runs or more fire runs? I'll bet you they'll say the former. They're doing more drug overdose runs than they are fire runs. We're all paying for that. Talk to your sheriff or your local police chief and ask them what the #1 driver of crime is in your community. I'll bet they'll say it's opioids. Often it's people who are committing crimes like theft or shoplifting or fraud to be able to pay for the habit, $300, $400 a day or more, particularly if you're not working. There's a temptation to commit those crimes, and there's the craving for this drug that puts people in positions they never would have imagined they find themselves in. Think of the families who are broken up. Think of the kids who have lost their parents to this epidemic. In Ohio, we have more kids in foster care under care of the state than ever in our history. Go to your neonatal units in your hospital and ask them about this. They'll say it's the #1 issue affecting them because so many kids are being born to a mother who is addicted, and these kids have to be taken through withdrawal themselves. Little babies, you can hold them practically in the palm of your hand. I've gone to these neonatal units in Ohio and seen these babies, and it is heartbreaking because just like adults, they have to go through this tough withdrawal process. No baby should have to do that. So this issue is one where Congress has taken steps in the last year and a half, and I congratulate this body and the House for moving forward with some positive steps. But there is so much more to be done. And these two bills are a start. These two bills will help. They will help to save lives, they will help to get people back on track and help to ensure that people can live out their God-given purpose rather than get distracted through this epidemic, rather than getting off track with regard to family and work and dignity and self-respect. These two bills will help, giving law enforcement in our communities the tools they need and helping our communities to be able to have a comprehensive approach here to turn back this assault of addiction in our country. I hope we can move quickly in the Senate to pass this legislation so the President can sign it into law and we can begin to make a bigger difference. Mr. President, I yield back my time and note the absence of quorum.